In this video, I'm going to be making another finger plane. This is my first one. This is just a little test playing around thing just to see if I can make one. And it turned out pretty good. There's a few things that I'm going to change for the next one that you guys are watching the video for. But here it is. So it's just got a wedge that goes against this pin and it holds the blade in at the right angle for this blade. So I'm going to make one out of a piece of stabilized wood. So you don't have to use stabilized wood, but I wanted to use stabilized wood because it's a lot more dense than regular wood. So you could use something like this here. This is Greenheart. You could use Greenheart or Lignum Vitae if you wanted to. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to use stabilized wood, and we sell that stuff on our Etsy store, me and my dad. So I'll put a link to that in the description. And yeah, so if you want to follow along, you need a piece of wood that's 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch. This happens to be, oh boy, what is it? It should be 5.5 inches long. And it is, oh, this one's actually 6, so this is a bit long for a blank, but this is 6 inches long. You don't need it to be quite this long. What I'm going to do for step number 1 is I'm going to square up the blank. So all that I'm going to do to square this blank up is go on my belt sander and sand it flat until it comes out square and even with the calipers that I have here. Well, there we have it. So I called it squaring up the blank, but it's really just about getting two sides that are away from each other parallel. That way the inside, because this is what we're making right now, the inside blocks are parallel with each other. So this here is a 2-inch finger plane. So if you're making a 2-inch finger plane, then you're going to need to now take this and cut it at 2 inches. Now, if you decide to make a different size finger plane, obviously adjust the measurements accordingly. Okay, so now that I have this 2-inch section, I can actually go ahead and make the inside blocks and rip this down into 2 thin strips. So you should be able to make at least 2 finger planes out of 1 piece of stabilized wood. So this stuff here will make 2 planes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually next rip this to about 1/8 of an inch. It's not a super fussy measurement. You just want it to be fairly even the whole way across, and you want to have 2 of them. If you're making 2 planes, you should be able to make 4 out of this. Well, there we have it. A whole bunch of pieces. Actually, I was able to make 6 out of this because I made them less than 1/8 of an inch. But as long as they're thick enough that they will hold together for the sides, it's not too fussy. The thicker you have it, the more of a gap there is going to be between where you're cutting and the side of your plane. But the thinner that you have it, then the more likely you are to break it. So it's a bit of a risk to take, but at the same time, these are pretty simple to make. So now what I need, going by the measurements of what I used on here, is a 1/2 inch piece, but this gap is too big. I was told to make that a lot smaller, so I'm going to make that gap about 1/8 of an inch this time. So instead of a 1/2 inch, you're going to make it 5/8 of an inch from the front. So I'm going to make a cut 5/8 of an inch in. And this is going to be my front block. And I have enough material here for sure to make 2. So I'm going to do that twice. Well, there we have it. So here's the block for the first one that I'm going to make. So basically the process is going to be that I need to cut this in half, glue this in at the right angle, the proper angle. It's not a right angle, obviously. And then once it's all glued together, square it up, drill a hole, and make a wedge and a blade and stick it all together. So I'm going to cut this to the right length now. So if you're making 2, you should be able to make 2 out of this. I want to have 1/8 of an inch gap. So right from the front, I have this flush here. I'm going to make a mark back there, 5/8 of an inch. Now obviously you can do that with your ruler, but you can do it with a block too, in case you're making a different size. So I'm going to make 1/8 of an inch hole here. And just double check that at the angle that I have this at. Let's see what angle this is. And 25 degrees. So at a 25-degree angle, This is going to be hard to mark a 25-degree angle on something so small. So if you need to make an angle on something tiny like this, one trick that you can do is you can actually make the angle on something a lot bigger and trace a line, and then you have a smaller system to go by. So I need to go to the center of my center ruler. This is just how my protractor works on this. I just go from here to wherever the line is there. So that's 25 degrees there. So now I can go like so. I'm going to double check that that makes sense with my little microplane, finger plane. Yes, that makes sense. That's perfect. When I made this one, I went by another plane. I didn't actually go by a specific measurement, so I didn't know what the angle was, but now I do, 25 degrees. So now I can go here, line up this little mark with the corner, keep the bottom edge straight with the edge, and now I have my mark here. So I can go from a line, point to point, and there, that's where the back is going to go. So I'm just going to double check to make sure that there's enough material here. And there's enough material here to make two. Yes, so I'm going to cut this right there where that line is, so right down the middle. Now the length of this isn't too fussy. If you're only making one, you can overhang it quite a bit. I was just double checking to make sure that it's going to fit. It is just under 1 3/8 on that side, and it is just about 1 3/8 on this side. So if you have a 6-inch block, then you're going to want 1 3/8 for this if you're making the 2-inch size plane and you're making two of them. I'm going to be using this super glue to join mine together. You don't have to use super glue. You can use regular wood glue, but I want this to be quick. So super glue here, make sure there's enough. I want to have a little bit of squeeze out, make sure that there's enough. So I'm going to place my block there. I'm going to actually glue this all together under clamping pressure, even though I'm doing it with super glue, because I want to make sure that it is as good of a joint as possible. So the reason why you wanted those two sides square, which you should make sure you keep track of which sides are which, is so that it sits flat right now. Okay. So the best way to do this is to make sure that you line up the top the whole way across. So that's not quite lined up. So you want it to be lined up, because otherwise you'll end up having an out of square plane, and then it's just going to be a lot harder for you to get it back in square. So I need to clamp this together and spray it with the accelerator. You could obviously put this in a vise if you have one. You probably do. Most people have a vise. So obviously you could put this in a vise, or you can just use a couple clamps like I'm about to. One from either end makes it easier to get the handles going. So make sure that your two sides are as parallel and straight with each other as possible. Clamp it all together, and if you're using wood glue, make sure that you let it set long enough before you do the next step, because otherwise it will fall apart. But with super glue, it's going to dry as soon as, like within 5 minutes, it'll be dry. Alright, so this is dry. So the next step is actually squaring up the block. So I'm going to use the bandsaw to cut off the majority of this, and then I'm going to go over to my belt sander and I'm going to square it all up. So now you need to make a blade. You could use a chisel. I have a 3/4 inch chisel that fits in here perfectly, and figure out some way of clamping it down either with a pin and a wedge like I'm going to be doing. That would work quite well. Or you can make your own by cutting up an old plane blade or something that's similar metal. So what I'm going to do is cut up this old plane blade. I've already cut some plane blades out of this, so it's probably not perfectly square, but I'm going to be grinding it up afterwards anyway. And I actually want it to be slightly smaller than this, which is actually just a hair over 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to cut it to 3/4 of an inch. and I'm going to have to cut this with a hacksaw because that's all I have to cut this metal with. So bear with me while I'm cutting that. That's going to take a while. To do is lay out where the blade's going to go so that you can figure out where your pin needs to be. This piece that was right here will be saved and used to make a wedge. So I'm going to cut this at a shallower taper, something more like, use this as a straight edge for right now. Something more like that, more or less cut it in half. And I'll use that as a wedge to hold the blade in. Have it. There's a plane. Now I'm just going to snap off this blade and I'm going to sand that down a little bit afterwards, but yep, that's a finger plane. Now I'm going to clean mine up, but that is pretty much it for now. It's looking pretty good. I'm pleased with it. It cuts decent. Now the blade's a little bit too narrow for the plane. I just probably ground it a little bit too far. But yeah, so basically that's it. You drill a hole through, you stick your bit in, snap it off. It can be removed easily. If you wanted to glue it in, you could. The wedge holds the blade in, and yeah. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed.